Let me just finish by mentioning a couple of things on Korea, really just a couple of key messages. One is that the contraction in Korea has been less severe than some other countries in the region and around the world. As I mentioned at the outset, we're expecting growth at minus 1.1% for the year. So there's been less of a domestic hit to growth in Korea. It really comes down to the very weak external environment and how that's weighed on exports. But with the pickup in China now, we are starting to see an improvement in Korea's exports, both to China and globally. Korea had some fiscal space going into this crisis. Its fiscal deficits and debt ratio over the last few years had been well below peers. It's using that room now. It's had 3 rounds of fiscal stimulus this year. So now we're projecting the public finances over the next couple of years to really track peer median levels, both with respect to debt ratios and the fiscal deficit. So with that, let me hand over to Andrew now to talk about China. Andrew, over to you.
A couple of questions on Korea. Steve touched on some Korean issues during his opening remarks, but people are asking about what the higher government debt to GDP level might mean for the rating. Also a specific question on a number that we had identified in the past, which was a 46% of GDP number that we had suggested previously might be something to look at from a rating perspective. I suppose the question is that number still relevant? So maybe you could give us your thoughts on Korean government debt levels going forward.
That 46% of GDP number that we mentioned in our last review, that was prior to really the outbreak of coronavirus and the coronavirus pandemic, which of course has led to a pretty significant change in how the world and how we view things from a ratings perspective. So certainly in the context of Korea, we have seen a fairly significant increase in debt to GDP ratios relative to Korea's history, certainly. But if we look at relative to other AA economies and other AA advanced economies in particular, we see that Korea's the increase in Korea's debt to GDP ratio is really in line with that AA median. And so in our view, this is essentially, we see Korea as having fiscal space to respond to the coronavirus shock in the near term. And the amount of fiscal stimulus that the Korean government has used so far is not out of line with the deterioration that we're seeing elsewhere. And so I think in that sense, the fiscal impact, will certainly have a rating impact, but it's not necessarily something that will move the rating in the near term. Now, as Steve mentioned in the presentation, we are looking at the medium-term plans and how the Korean government plans to manage fiscal policy over the medium term, and that will be something that will play into our rating quite a bit, especially as Korea does have aging population and other demographic pressures that will put some pressure on public finances as well. So yeah, I think what's sort of key to the Korea rating is that we see that they have fiscal space in the near term, and then we'll be looking at closely how the authorities plan to manage fiscal policy over the medium term.
To you, and it's just really a clarification question on the growth rate for Korea, specifically the change in the global economic outlook projection, which will be announced today. So if you could just remind us what the growth rates are for Korea.
Yeah, with the new global economic outlook, which Brian mentioned will be published later today, we are revising slightly down our full year growth projection for Korea from -0.9 to -1.1. That reflects the resurgence of the virus, and some of the measures to contain it will will constrain domestic spending just a little bit, but it doesn't alter really our broad macroeconomic outlook for Korea. We still expect growth to turn positive in the second half of the year and for a more robust recovery next year.